We're going to be talking about schedules of reinforcement to start off. And when we're talking about a schedule of reinforcement, we're talking about how often and in what pattern an organism is going to get reinforcement. And so in the past, we have talked about reinforcement versus punishment and whether it's positive or negative. For most of this stuff with schedules of reinforcement, it's going to be easiest to think about it in terms of positive reinforcement, giving some creature, some animal or organism, something that's rewarding. Because most operant conditioning, most operant experiments that you'll encounter involve actually giving an animal, say, food for making a correct response. And so a lot of this will be phrased around positive reinforcement, but just keep in mind that if the situation called for it, you could actually shape some of this schedules of reinforcement and use it with any of the other kinds of reinforcement or punishment, so positive or negative. It's just easiest for us to talk about it in terms of positive reinforcement. And so our types of reinforcement are going to fall under two broad categories. The first of which is our continuous reinforcement. And as the name might suggest, it's going to be continuously reinforced. So every single time the animal makes the correct response, they're going to get that reinforcement. They're going to get their reward. So if we use our example of a rat in an operant box who's pushing a lever, every single time the rat pushes that lever, they're going to get food. So that's a continuously reinforced behavior. So the rat pushes the lever and gets food, pushes the lever and gets food. So every single time they're getting that reward. Most of what we're going to talk about from here on is going to deal with partial reinforcement. And so you might be able to figure out partial reinforcement just means that you're not going to be rewarded every single time. Only some of those correct responses, those lever presses that our rat is making, only some of those are going to be reinforced. So maybe the first time the rat presses the lever, he's going to get some food, but the second and the third and the fourth time he presses the lever, he's not going to get any food. But after some time goes on, he pushes the lever again and he gets food again. So the behavior of pushing the lever is still being reinforced. It's just not being reinforced on every single trial. And so we'll get into some reasons why it's useful to be able to use partial reinforcement. But right off the bat, I can tell you that as a practical point, if you have a rat in a box and every time they press a lever, they get food, they're going to get full really quickly. So maybe they push the lever 100 times and they have more food than they know what to do with, then there's no reason for them to keep pushing that lever. There's no reason for them to participate in whatever experiment you're running. Whereas if we use something like partial reinforcement, they could push the lever 100 times, but maybe they only get food 1 in 10 times they push the lever. So all of a sudden, instead of getting 100 things of food, now they're only getting 10. And so partial reinforcement is a really quick and easy way for us to make sure that the animal isn't satiated or full from getting rewarded for participating. But we'll talk about some more reasons why it's beneficial to use continuous or partial reinforcement as we get through and talk about different types of each. And so in our last lecture, I had warned you that this part of the chapter involves quite a few dichotomous variables. So we had our positive versus negative and our punishment versus reinforcement. Those are two choices that you can make, and then we combined them into 4 options: positive punishment, negative punishment, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. And in that same kind of a pattern, we're actually going to do the exact same thing again here with our types of partial reinforcement. So there's only one real way that you can have continuous reinforcement. That is that you always get rewarded. But for partial reinforcement, we're going to have a bunch of ways that you can have that kind. And so the first question we want to ask is it a fixed partial reinforcement or is it variable? And so if it is fixed, the reinforcement will occur after a fixed number of responses or after a fixed time interval. So we could use the rule of after 10 lever presses, then the rat gets food. Or after 10 seconds, if the rat presses the lever, it gets food. So in both cases, it's 10, and that 10 doesn't change. It's a fixed number. For our variable partial reinforcement, reinforcement is going to occur after an average or a variable, a changing number of responses have occurred, or after a variable or changing passage of time has passed. So we could say that if the rat presses the lever 10 times, and then we introduce that variability plus or minus 4, then it gets food. And so what that plus or minus 4 tells us is that there's an average of 10. That's about what we would expect overall. But our variability says that it could be as low as 6 minus 4, or as high as 14 presses plus 4. And the rat could get rewarded after anywhere in that range. So they might get food on the 6th lever press, and they might have to wait all the way until the 14th lever press, but overall, across all of their trials, there should be about an average of 10 lever presses, but with that variability. So if you see average in a description of how they're being reinforced, or if you see a clarification of plus or minus a certain number, we're talking about variable. But if we say after exactly 10, or if we don't quantify it with an average or a plus or minus, if we say just a number, it's going to be a fixed partial reinforcement. The variable are the ones that start introducing that wiggle room. And so keep that in mind while we go off to our next question that we ask, where there are two options. And so we can talk about a ratio or an interval type of partial reinforcement. And so for a ratio, ratios make you think of mathematics, so we're thinking about exact numbers. So for a ratio partial reinforcement, a certain percentage of responses are reinforced. So say 1 in 10 lever presses would be rewarded. An interval is stating that a certain amount of time has to elapse between reinforcements. So the first time the rat presses a lever, after 10 seconds have passed. So if you see a absolute number of lever presses, so 1 out of 10 lever presses gets food, it's going to be a ratio reinforcement. And if we're talking about how much time passes before they get rewarded, that's going to be an interval of that partial reinforcement. And so hopefully those two dichotomies are nice and clear, because now we're going to stick them together, because you can have a ratio or interval plus our back one here, our fixed or variable. So you can intermix the two. And so if we want to look at our first of the 4 combinations we can have a fixed ratio schedule. So fixed is telling us it's going to be an absolute value. It's not going to be an average. It's going to be an exact. And ratio tells us it's going to be a number. So a fixed ratio or FR schedule, because of course researchers love to abbreviate and shorten things, but a fixed ratio schedule is when you get reinforcement after a fixed number of responses. So specifically, you push a lever 10 times, and on the 10th push, you get food reward. Then you would have to press the lever 10 more times to get another food reward. It's fixed, it's unchanging, and it's a ratio, so it's a number. We can also have a variable ratio schedule. So ratio still, so it's going to be a number of lever presses. But it's variable, so we're introducing that average and plus or minus a few. So reinforcement is given after a variable number of responses centered around an average. So you would get rewarded after an average of 10 lever presses plus or minus whatever our span is. So maybe plus or minus 4 was the example we've used previously. So those two are pretty straightforward. And then we can look at the interval side of it. So we can have a fixed interval schedule, again, shortened to FI sometimes. And so fixed meaning that there isn't any of that variability. There's no averages, it's just a number. And interval tells us that it is an amount of time that passes. So in this case, a fixed interval schedule means that you would be reinforced for the first correct response, that first lever press, after a fixed time interval has passed. So after 10 seconds, the first time you press the lever, you would get food. And then our variable interval schedule, our VI schedule, says that reinforcement is given for the first correct response after a variable time interval, so a specific time plus or minus a little bit, centered around a particular average. So the first time you press the lever after 10 seconds on average, but there's some variability, so it could be plus or minus 4 seconds. So you could get rewarded as early as after 6 seconds have elapsed, or you might have to wait all the way up until 14 seconds have passed, because that's the upper end of the options that could happen because of that variability. So if you can just remember the difference between fixed and variable, and ratio versus interval, you should be able to tell these apart. And it would be a good idea if, say, I gave you an example of a situation. And I talked about, say, a child has been told to clean his room, and his mom will tell him to clean his room 3 different times. And after the 3rd time, if he hasn't cleaned his room, then she will get mad. So he knows that without doubt, it's always 3 times she asks for him to clean his room, so he can wait until the 3rd time he's told before he goes and cleans his room, because he knows nothing will happen after the first 2 times he's told. So that would be a fixed ratio schedule, because our number is the number of times his mom asks him to clean his room, and it's fixed because it is always 3 times before he gets in trouble. And that's actually a good example of not using positive reinforcement, but one of the other types. All right, and so this graph is actually going to show us what's going on for an animal when they're receiving one of these partial reinforcement schedules. So how are they responding over time if they're on one of those 4 types of partial reinforcement? And so for this graph, across the bottom we have time. So over here would be the beginning of a session, and then towards this side would be the end of a session. And then on this side, it's cumulative number of responses. So for us, we've been talking about rats pushing a lever. So this would be how many times has our rat pressed a lever during this session. And so we're going to talk about a nice easy one up front. And this is our variable ratio. So if we think back to just a second ago, variable meaning that there's an average, not an exact amount, and ratio meaning that it's going to be number of presses. So that's our idea of you're going to press the lever 10 times on average, plus or minus 4. And if we look at these tick marks on the side of this line, each tick is telling us that the rat received reinforcement. They got food for pushing the lever. And you can see, because it's variable, they're not occurring at nice even intervals. They're sort of happening at, not quite at random, but less consistently. So that's where that variability comes in. And if we look at the behavior, how often the rat presses the lever over time, they're going to push the lever really quickly, because the faster they push the lever, the faster they're going to be rewarded. But they also are going to push it consistently, because even if they just got food, they don't know when the next food is coming. In here, in the middle there, they got reinforced almost right away after just having gotten food. So they're not going to slow down after getting food. They're just going to push the button as fast as they can because button pressing is determining how long they wait until they get that food. If we want to jump to the other side of the graph, we're actually going to look at the other smooth line, the purple line here, and this is for our variable interval this time. So variable, again, telling us that it isn't a sort of fixed and regularly occurring reinforcement, but this time it's an interval, so it's not button presses or lever pushes. In this case, it's amount of time that's passed. And so the rat still has to push the lever because they will get rewarded for pushing the lever after a certain amount of time has passed. And for our variable interval, we're saying that after 10 seconds have passed on average, plus or minus, say, 4 seconds. And so again, we see this nice smooth line. The rats aren't pushing the lever as quickly as they were in our variable ratio group because the rate at which they push the button doesn't really matter because this time they have to wait for time to pass. So they're going to push the button fairly regularly or push the lever interchangeably. And right here, again, we see that sometimes they will get rewarded twice back to back just because of how that variability worked out. And so even after they've been rewarded, they're going to keep pressing the lever at a regular rate because they're waiting for time to go by and they don't know when they might get rewarded next. And so we see a nice steady rate of responding, and so we get a nice straight line. And so those two are pretty reasonable to understand. They make quite a bit of sense. Then we get into these weird jagged shapes in the middle. And we're going to start with our fixed ratio. So we're going back to ratio, which means that the number of lever pushes is what's controlling whether they get rewarded or not. But this time, because it's fixed, we're saying that after every 10 lever presses, they would get a food reward. And so you can see these ticks are nice and evenly spaced because it's a fixed type of reinforcement. So they're going to push the button really, really quickly until they get their food reward. And then they know that they have to push the lever now 10 more times before they get food again. So after they get their food reward, they really don't want to push the lever again because it's not going to get them food. It's not going to happen right away. So we see these little plateaus where they take a break, they'll eat the food reward that they just got, and then eventually they'll start pressing the button again. But there's this little bit of a plateau, a little bit of delay where they don't push the button right away because they got their food reward. They were given food for having pushed the button that 10th time, and now they know that the next 9 times they press the button, they're not going to get anything. So they wait a little bit until they press it the whole 10 times to get the next food reward. And so we see these jagged steps where there's a wait time, a delay, after each time they get their food reward. And our fixed interval is similar, but it again looks a little bit different. So our green line has these little scallop shapes. And so we see that they're sort of slow responding to begin with. And then the responding gets faster and faster. They're pushing the button more and more. There's a steeper slope here until we hit the point that they get reinforced. And for our fixed interval, again, fixed because we can see that these are spaced regularly across time, the animal has to wait a particular amount of time before they get food. So we've used the example of after 10 seconds, then they can push that lever and get food. But at the very beginning, after only, say, 2 or 3 seconds, they know that pushing the lever isn't going to get them food, so they don't push the lever. But as we get closer to that 10-second point, when they could get food, they'll start pushing the button faster and more often because they really want to get that food reward. But again, same as with our fixed ratio, once they've gotten that food reward, they know that they won't be rewarded again right away. They have to wait another 10 seconds. So we see this plateau again, this sort of leveling off part where the rat stops pressing the lever until we get closer again to that next 10-second mark. And so we see this slowing down of lever pressing until we get closer to the next reward period, and then they press it more. And so we see that nice pattern there. And so we can look at all of these and kind of see the difference between our 4 different kinds of partial reinforcement and what kind of behaviors are going on because of those types of reinforcement. So with our types of reinforcement, you might have gotten to that point where you're wondering, okay, well, which one is the best? Pretty much every time we talk about methods of learning, we start wondering, okay, well, which is the most effective and in which situations? And so that's what this slide is for. This is going to help us walk through what's the best method of reinforcement. And so for continuous reinforcement, the one we talked about at the very beginning, where every single time you make the correct response, when you push that lever, you will get reinforcement. You'll get access to food. And that one is really, really good if what you're going for is quick learning. So our continuous reinforcement lets us have very rapid learning because every single time that the animal makes a response, every time they push that button or push the lever, they're going to get a desirable outcome. So they're going to form a strong relationship. They're going to learn that doing that response gets them that good outcome. So they're going to do the response more. And so in that way, the consequences of their action, of their responding, are easier to perceive. The downside here is that our extinction, losing that association, will be very, very rapid with continuous reinforcement. So imagine that every single time the rat pushes the lever, they get food. And then if you, as part of your experiment, want to see what happens if you don't have the lever press get them food on a trial or 2 or 3, the first time the rat pushes that lever and doesn't get a food reward, that's weird. It has never happened before. Every time they pushed the lever, they got food. So in their minds, the consequence of pushing the lever and then getting food has now changed. It's something new. It hasn't happened before. And so they have this extinction where they unlearn that relationship between pressing the lever and getting food. They're going to learn that extinction more quickly. And so even a few trials where they don't get their reward can cause that behavior, that response of lever pushing, to decrease and eventually stop. So if your experiment requires that there be periods where pushing the lever or flicking a switch or performing an action doesn't give them a reward later on, then a continuous reinforcement schedule is probably not the best way to go. If, however, you do want to use the continuous reinforcement method throughout the entirety of your experiment, then you could get away with it and you're going to see more rapid learning because they're forming associations much faster. So that's a good one to use depending on how your experiment is set up. For partial reinforcement, that's going to be our best option if you have to have periods where extinction might have happened. So the downside of using continuous reinforcement, if you're in a situation where you have to have a response produce no outcome, you're better off using one of our partial reinforcement type setups. So the downsides with partial reinforcement are that there's slower learning because after every lever press, you're not immediately seeing an outcome. So they're not making those associations between the consequences of their actions. So the learning process is a lot slower, but the converse is now that this is going to be more resistant to extinction. And this is especially true for our variable ratio schedule. Variable because they're not predictable. so the animals haven't learned a special rule. Because you can imagine if we were using a fixed ratio and every 10 button presses gets them food, if after the 10th press they suddenly don't get food, they might start learning and going through extinction because that's unusual. But if they're on a variable schedule, like our variable ratio, then after 10 button presses they don't get food, well, that's not unusual. Maybe this is one of those cases where it's 10 button presses plus some. So that variability makes them far more resistant to extinction, meaning that they're not going to stop responding just because they're not being rewarded anymore. So animals who have received partial reinforcement as they learned a process, they're actually more resistant and more resilient when it comes to extinction. They're going to maintain what they've learned for longer, especially when we compare them to our continuous reinforcement groups. All right, so that is tons on schedules of reinforcement. Next, we're going to move into escape and avoidance, which is actually going to be a pair of cases that are a special combination of classical and operant conditioning. And that will make more sense as we get into it. But we're going to blend together some of the things that we've learned throughout this chapter. And so for escape and avoidance, both are going to be principles that are based on negative reinforcement. So negative meaning the removal of something, and reinforcement meaning that it's going to cause an increase in the behavior because the outcome is good. So a negative reinforcement is that you're going to take away something bad so that the situation becomes better and the animal is going to be more likely to do the behavior that got rid of the bad stimulus. So we're going to start with escape behavior. We'll talk very briefly about avoidance, and then each of them gets their own slide where we can talk through the process in some more detail. But for escape behavior, this is basically when an animal performs a behavior that will specifically terminate an aversive stimulus. So if you're sitting in a room and there's a really loud buzzing noise, your behavior that you could perform is to get up and walk to a different room. So by doing that behavior, you terminated or stopped that annoying sound, our aversive stimulus, and you escaped a situation that was not good. So that was negative reinforcement because by leaving, your situation got better. For avoidance behavior, this is when you perform a behavior and it prevents the aversive stimulus from occurring. So maybe that annoying sound in the room was the sound of a vacuum cleaner, and you didn't want to listen to it. So for the escape behavior, when someone is vacuuming, you get up and you leave the room. For avoidance behavior, if you see your mother come into the room and she's going to vacuum, you can get up and leave before she starts vacuuming so that you can avoid the presence of that aversive stimulus. You're going to prevent your own exposure to that aversive or bad stimulus by performing a behavior that helps you avoid the situation. And so that's a vague example of it, but we're going to look at a specific case called a shuttle run. And it's called a shuttle run because we're looking at a cage where a rat will run from one side of the cage to the other. They're going to shuttle from one side to the other. And both escape conditioning and avoidance conditioning are going to use this exact same setup. And this is going to be kind of like a modified operant box, but not quite. So imagine that this is a rat cage that's been divided down the middle with a piece of plexiglass. And on the bottom, we have metal slats on the floor. And we've seen these before for when you electrify the floor, you can make the floor produce a mild shock that's uncomfortable. That mild shock is going to be our aversive stimulus here. And so this doorway that's cut out in the middle allows the rat to move freely from one side of the cage to the other. And then at the top here, we can have lights, maybe a cue light, some kind of stimulus that we could pay attention to. And so that's the basic setup. And so for our escape conditioning, our stimulus is going to be a shock. And what's happening is that one side of the cage, the floor will be electrified, and so it is uncomfortable to stand on the floor in that side of the cage. The correct response, that operant response that the rat should perform, is to cross the barrier and go into the other side where the floor isn't electrified and where they can stand comfortably. And the outcome that we see after the rat crosses that barrier to the other side is that the removal of shock has occurred. The floor on this side isn't electrified, so it doesn't hurt. They have now escaped that aversive stimulus. So that one's pretty straightforward. But our avoidance conditioning requires just a little bit more learning to happen. And in this case, we need something, a stimulus, that's going to tell us when the floor is going to become electrified. So we have to have some kind of learning that associates that stimulus, a discriminative stimulus perhaps, that the floor being electrified is going to happen. And so in this case, our stimulus is going to be a light. So up here or over here, one of them will light up, maybe just a plain old red light. And that red light means that the floor is going to be electrified on that side of the cage. And so if the rat sees that light and knows or has learned that that's associated with the floor being electrified and getting a shock, then if this is the light that came on and they know this floor will be electrified, they can perform a response of crossing the barrier to the other side of the cage. And the outcome is that they get to avoid the shock. They left before the shock even happened because there was a stimulus, that light, that told them it was coming. So they learn something about the light first, and then they can use that to make a decision to avoid experiencing that unpleasant or aversive stimulus when the floor becomes electrified on that side of the cage. We're going to talk about the processes that are involved, and specifically we're going to look at avoidance because the escape learning was pretty straightforward. We talked about our stimulus, our response, and our outcome, but our avoidance learning or our avoidance conditioning is going to involve two processes. And like I said before, this is where we start bringing in both classical and operant conditioning. And so first off, we're going to look at the classical conditioning. And this is when you have classically conditioned a fear response to a conditioned stimulus. And so that's what that cue light, the red light that the animal has to learn is associated with the floor being electrified. That's where that light comes in. And so if we think back to our section on classical conditioning, at the beginning, a red light on the wall doesn't really mean much to a rat. So that's going to start as a neutral stimulus. There's no meaning to it. So that red light turns on, doesn't mean anything to the rat, but then the floor becomes electrified. And so that unconditioned stimulus, the one that they don't have to learn about, is going to cause a fear response, an unconditioned response, because the floor is uncomfortable, so they're going to be afraid and they're going to run to the other side of the cage. Eventually, as they acquire this classically conditioned relationship, that light becomes a conditioned stimulus where they know that that light happens before the floor becomes electrified, and so they can respond to the light itself rather than waiting for the discomfort of that aversive stimulus, and they can perform a conditioned response, that fear response, and they could run to the other side of the cage. And so this classical conditioning portion is important and essential for this avoidance part of it because they need to know that the light is telling them that the floor will be electrified so that they can avoid that electrification. And once they've learned that process, the rest is operant conditioning. So it's the escape response because of a fear-evoking discriminative stimulus. And in this case, our discriminative stimulus is the same as our conditioned stimulus. It's just because between classical conditioning and operant conditioning, they use different terms. So this light, this cue light, is a conditioned stimulus in the first part because they have learned or been conditioned to associate it with that shock sensation. And down here, it's a discriminative stimulus because it's initiating the response that the rat produces to climb over the barrier or to pass through that doorway cut between the two halves. And by performing that response, their outcome is a reduction in fear. So by avoiding the situation, they get away. When this light tells them to perform that response action, they're going to reduce their fear and they completely avoid the electrified floor. So escape learning can be explained just by operant conditioning, but avoidance learning has to involve both classical and operant conditioning. So they're going to work together on that one.